This morning, our scripture is from Matthew chapter 15, verses 21 through 28. Then Jesus left Galilee and went north to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Gentile woman who lived there came to him pleading, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David, for my daughter is possessed by a demon that torments her severely." But Jesus gave her no reply, not even a word. Then his disciples urged him to send her away. "Tell her to go away," they said. "She's bothering us with all her begging." Then Jesus said to the woman, "I was sent only to help God's lost sheep, the people of Israel." But she came and worshipped him, pleading again, "Lord, help me." Jesus responded, "It isn't right to take food from the children and throw it to the dogs." She replied, "That's true, Lord, but even dogs are allowed to eat the scraps that fall beneath their master's table." "Dear woman," Jesus said to her, "your faith is great. Your request is granted." And her daughter was instantly healed. Back in 1959, Frank Sinatra had a hit song entitled "High Hopes." In fact, it was such a popular song that John F. Kennedy used it as part of his campaign, only with some changed lyrics to make it fit who he was. But the original chorus to "High Hopes" went like this: "But he's got high hopes, he's got high hopes, he's got high apple pie in the sky hopes." Have you ever had that kind of hope? High pie in the sky hopes? That sounds like a great kind of hope to have. And certainly we know people who have had that. You've had it. Perhaps when you were thinking about getting married and you were going to propose marriage, you had hopes that that person you were proposing to was going to say yes. That was a high hope. Or when you were having children and you were looking forward to the birth of that child, and you had high hopes for how this child would be raised in your home and what the future of that child would be. There's all kinds of experiences in life where we have high hopes for dreams that we have for ourselves or for others. High hopes, high apple pie in the sky hope. That's great hope to have. That's wonderful hope for us to experience. Well, this morning, we meet a woman who has high hopes. Now, she has a demon-possessed daughter, and she says that she would go to Jesus and she'd say, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David, for my daughter is possessed by a demon that torments her severely." Now, we may not know demon-possessed people, but we certainly know people that have within them great difficulty functioning in our world, usually because of mental illness or some other emotional problem. We know of people who suffer greatly from the thoughts that they have in their heads, that they're all jumbled together and they can't seem to get a hold of or get a grasp on reality. We know, for example, that those who suffer from such thoughts have a great instability in their lives. And it's hard for them to get a job. And it's hard for them to find their place in the world. And oftentimes they are homeless. In fact, it's said that 20 to 25% of the homeless people in the U.S. suffer from some form of mental illness. So mental illness has the effect of tormenting one severely. And the woman in our story had a daughter who was tormented severely. So this woman comes to Jesus with high hopes that Jesus can do something for her daughter. She has heard of Jesus. She has heard what Jesus has done for others. And so she comes hoping and pleading for his help. And yet, she has no real reason to have this hope. Why? Well, because she's not Jewish. She's a Gentile. In fact, she's a Canaanite woman specifically. She is not among the chosen people that Jesus has come to work with. In fact, first Jesus says nothing, and then he says, I was sent only to help God's lost sheep, the people of Israel. It sounds like a crushing statement, doesn't it? It's kind of a who's in and who's out, and she's out. Have you ever had that kind of experience? Maybe at school or at work. You weren't part of the in crowd. You weren't part of the clique. You weren't part of the little group that got together, and you were one of those who were excluded. Or maybe you have felt discrimination in your past because of your weight or your height or your nationality or where you came from. It's a sickening feeling to be left out. It's a sickening feeling not to be accepted. It's a sickening feeling to be ostracized. It's a sickening feeling to be rejected. And it's what this woman might be hearing as she comes to Jesus and he tells her that he has come to help God's lost sheep, the people of Israel, of which she is not included. Despite what Jesus says, she still has high hopes. It says that she came and she worshiped him and again pleaded, Lord, help me. Lord, help me. We sometimes know such desperation. Maybe it's when we have that health diagnosis that is difficult for us to comprehend. Or maybe it comes when we don't even get a health diagnosis, where we know we're suffering physically, but the doctors can't seem to put a handle on it, and we're struggling with these health issues. Or maybe it happens when we're overwhelmed with a personal or a family crisis, and we are struggling with these issues and we don't know what to do about it. We know what it's like to feel hopeless. But yet this woman is not about to give up. And yet Jesus' next words to her are anything but comforting. He says to her, it isn't right to take food from the children and throw it to the dogs. Now I got to tell you, this verse makes pastors and theologians very uncomfortable. It just doesn't seem to fit what we know about Jesus. And sometimes we want to take Thomas Jefferson's approach. Thomas Jefferson did many wonderful things. One of the things that he did that maybe isn't so wonderful is that he took the Bible and he edited it. He took things out that he didn't understand or he didn't like. So, for example, he took out the miracle stories of Jesus, and he took out Jesus' resurrection because he couldn't quite make sense of it. And maybe we're tempted to do that with this verse because it doesn't quite fit our understanding of who Jesus is. And some commentators have made different suggestions as to what's happening here. One suggested that Jesus simply was tired and his humanness was showing. He'd been very busy, and he simply is tired, and he just had it, and he needed some rest, and so he said something that we might think just doesn't make sense and probably wasn't a nice thing to say. Others, commentators, have said it wasn't meant in a demeaning way, that in fact it was referring to lapdogs. And we know how people feel about lapdogs, right? Lapdogs for many people are like their children. And so maybe it was really a good thing. It was kind of a way of being encouraging to her. Because we know how people feel about their pets. Well, I came across some letters to God by dogs that I thought were real interesting. And these are things that dog lovers might appreciate. So one dog writes, "Dear God, when we get to heaven, can we sit on your couch, or is it the same old story?" And I think of Denise's dog, Shayla. When I got married, I inherited a dog. And Denise would always go up to bed at 9 o'clock, and I usually stayed to 10 o'clock downstairs. And if it got to be a little past 10 o'clock, Shayla would start her prancing because she wanted the couch. Now, Shayla wasn't allowed on the couch, but she knew that when I went upstairs that she'd be able to go on the couch because nobody would chase her away. So come 10 o'clock, she'd get a little bit of anxiousness and wanted me to leave. So I can appreciate that. When we get to heaven, it's the same old story. Here's another one from a dog. "Dear God, if a dog barks his head off in the forest and no human hears him, is he still a bad dog?" And here's one, "Dear God, are there mailmen in heaven? If so, will I have to apologize?" Well, we may like dogs, and we might elevate our dogs to the status of favored children in our families, but at the same time, I don't think any of us appreciate being called a dog. And this woman is kind of being called a dog. One commentator suggested that Jesus said this in a friendly tone. And from the woman's response, it seems that that's the way she took it. For she said, "That's true, Lord, but even dogs are allowed to eat the scraps that fall beneath their master's table." In other words, she has no problem being called a dog if her daughter will be healed. She reveals the same hope that dogs have at the supper table of getting table scraps from generous humans. Dogs never seem to give up hope of receiving even a small morsel from the hands of those who are eating their supper. And I have to believe that if there are small children in a home, that makes dogs even more hopeful. Martin Luther was talking to his university students about his puppy who was named Topel. And Luther said that at the table, Topel looked for a morsel from his master and watched with open mouth and motionless eyes, just kind of staring. Luther said, "Oh, if I could only pray the way this dog watches the meat." All his thoughts are concentrated on the piece of meat. You may have had such a pet. And this woman is like a dog looking in hope, not for meat, but for healing of her daughter. Oh, to have such hope. Do you have that kind of hope? When you think of the situation that you're in right now, do you have that kind of hope? When you think of the issues that you're facing, or your family members are facing, or your friends are facing, do you have that kind of hope? I came across an illustration on hope. In this illustration, there's two rooms. One is full of brand new toys, and the other room is full of hay and horse manure. So two children are there to look at these rooms. One is a pessimist and one is an optimist. Well, the one who is a pessimist goes into the first room with all the toys and begins to cry because he realizes that in time all these wonderful toys will end up broken anyway. Well, the second child, the optimist, she goes into the other room and she begins shoveling. And she says, "I know there has to be a horse in here somewhere." That's hope. What we know about hope. There's a kind of hope that is wishful thinking. I hope I get a raise, or I hope I get a promotion, or I hope I win the lottery. How many, 300 million people or so has that hope today? But then there is biblical hope. And the New Bible Dictionary defined biblical hope in this way. Hope is a belief in the living God who acts and intervenes in human life and who can be trusted to implement his promises. To shorten it, it simply says this: our hope is in a loving and living God who acts in our lives. Our hope is in a loving and living God who acts in our lives. And that's what this Canaanite woman believed about Jesus, that Jesus could act in her life and in the life of her child to bring about healing. She believed in Jesus, the Son of God and a son of David, and what he could do. She had faith in Jesus, and this gave her hope. It gave her high apple pie in the sky kind of hope. We know those times that we go through that are difficult and trying times in our lives. Where do we turn? Can we have hope? I'll answer the second question first. Yes, we can have hope. And where do we turn? We turn to the living and loving God who acts. Biblical hope is not based on what we can do or what others can do by themselves or ourselves. Rather, biblical hope trusts in God for what God can do in us and through others and with others. A wise person once said that hope is but an anchor of the soul. Hope is an anchor of the soul. And certainly it was true for this woman. Hope was the anchor of her soul. Is hope the anchor of our souls? Do we have high hopes in God? Well, Jesus responded to this woman with affection. He said to her, "Dear woman, your faith is great, your request is granted." And her daughter was healed. We rejoice in this healing, yet we know from experience that it doesn't always turn out that way. We know that when we pray for healing or for other things, our prayers aren't always answered in the way that we would like. Should we give up hoping? Should we just say, well, okay? The way I answer that is just through a book that had a great impact on me a couple of years ago. It's a book about Mother Teresa. And you know about Mother Teresa, this wonderful nun who went to Calcutta, and she worked among the poorest of the poor, and she helped those who were sick, those who were starving. She made a tremendous difference. She and the other nuns that worked with her, she made a wonderful difference. In the book, Come Be My Light, this is all described, and it talks about the call that she received from Christ to minister to these poor people. But then it also talks about how when she continued to pray, she found Jesus to be silent. He wasn't answering her. And she went through a dark night of the soul, and she went through a great faith struggle. And for years she struggled because she wanted to hear from God and she didn't feel she was. And yet she never lost hope. for she saw what God was doing through her and through the other nuns who worked among the poor. And despite this absence of God, she held on to her faith. Why? Because she believed she was in the hands of the living God, and that could give her hope no matter what. High hopes. Have them. Frank Sinatra's song continues, and it talks about an ant who hoped to move a rubber tree plant, but of course, we know that an ant can't. And then it also talks about that silly old ram who thought he could punch a hole in the dam and kept butting away. Both had high hopes. Well, unlike that ant and unlike that ram, we have an actual reason to have high hopes. We can have high hopes because we have a living and loving God who comes to us, who walks beside us in the midst of our struggles, and who may minister to us through other people. In fact, may even use us to minister to those who need some hope. So let us trust and let us hope in a living and loving God who acts. Amen.